Alright, g'day everyone. In this set of videos I'm going to be talking to you about how you prepare to route out, using the CNC router, a product like this. So something that's made out of panels. Obviously this is a fairly complex one, it's got lots of parts, but generally a product that's made out of panels. And the way you're going to start this is by creating a 2D sketch in Fusion 360. So just one sketch, right? And it's not a particularly challenging task doing this. You just got to know some sort of key points, and then you should manage to be able to do this fairly effectively. So when you do it, you're going to start a brand new design, and you're going to start with a sketch. I'm going to pick this bottom plane as the place where I draw this sketch. Then using the rectangle tool, I'm going to draw the piece of material that I'm going to use. So if you're a Year 11 student, you'll be using a 1200 by 2400 board. If you're a Year 10 student, you'll be using a 1200 by 1200 board, so a square. So once you've got your area in there, right, we need to start drawing individual components. And as we work in this, it's going to get messy because we're going to have lots of dimensions and things. So I'm going to move some of the dimensions I've got in here out, right? And then I'm going to start placing components. I'm going to do this primarily using the 2-point rectangle tool because I want to create closed shapes, essentially, closed profiles. So let's imagine that I have a part for my product which is 400 millimeters wide and 600 millimeters long. It's going to be a rectangle like that. I'll hit enter, and there's the rectangle for that part. All right, that gives me the full outline of that component. Now, when I create components on this sheet and want to cut them out with the CNC router, I have to give them a correct dimension between the component and the outside of the piece of material, and then later between components. So initially, I'll use the D key on the keyboard or this button here, the sketch dimension button, to dimension my box 20 millimeters away from any edge. And the further you can put some of these dimensions away from the inside of this sketch, the simpler it's going to look and the easier it's going to be to read as you get more and more components in there. So 20 millimeters away on both of those. Now, where I've got another piece adjoining it, so let's say I had two pieces the same here, I draw in my next piece, same size, let's say they're the same, and I would need to again dimension from the outside edge by 20, but again between components 30 millimeters, right? Let's move that outside. So we've got those two shapes there, and they are 30 millimeters apart and 20 millimeters in from the edge. Now, as I start to add joints, I'm going to do this rather specifically. So if I want to add a rebate, say, to the end of a piece like this, I'm going to select the 2-point rectangle tool, line it up with the end so I can see that little X, and then I'm going to drag out just slightly, click, and create a rectangle that's bigger than my shape, right, like that. Now the reason I've created a rectangle that's bigger is because this allows me to now dimension it to the correct size for that rebate. So let's assume that I'm using 17 millimeter material. I'll click on one side of the rectangle and the other side and create a dimension of 17. Alright, I've just done that wrong because you can see mine's moved away from the edge, so I'm actually going to change that and redo that. And I'm going to redo that rectangle, do exactly the same thing, but this time I'm going to leave the length over length, but the width, if I hit tab, which currently says 42.062, I'm going to change to 17. I'm going to hit enter again. So I've set the width of it, I haven't set the length. To set the length, I'm going to put in a dimension of 5 millimeters away from the outside of my shape. Now the reason I do exactly 5 millimeters is so that my cutter comes just outside that area so that I don't have to clean out any material later after I take my work out of the CNC router. So if I have a rebate that's going all the way off the edges, they must go 5 millimeters over the edge, right? That's really important. And then obviously the width is the width of the rebate that I'm after. Where I do a housing, it's much the same. So I would draw a rectangle somewhere in here at the correct width. So like I talked about before, the width would be 17 if I'm using 17 mil material. Not worried about the length right now, just hit enter. In fact, I don't want the length at all. Now I'll do the same thing I did before with the 5mm distance. And do that top and bottom. Right, so it's overhanging both sides there. Next, I need to position this housing. So let's assume that between this housing and this rebate, I have 300mm of distance. Again, using the dimension tool each time. Every time you see me use it, I've hit the D key on the keyboard. So I've dimensioned things apart. The only other types of joints you may use are a stopped housing, in which case you would start inside your shape and go out over the edge a little bit. And again, you still make it the correct width, so 17, but the length is outside of your shape. As far as your dimensions for a shape like this, where you're stopping before you get to the edge, you'd want to stop probably 20mm from your edge. In fact, I'm going to do my other end first, where my 5mm is, because that doesn't change. Right, so 5mm there, and then at the other end, 20mm from the outside of the shape. So this is a stopped housing. Now, thanks to that piece, it's going to stop when it makes that cut just in from the outer edge of my piece, so I won't be able to see the housing from, say, the front of my cabinet. Stopped housing. The other type of joint you might do is something like a miter joint on a corner. To do a miter joint, all you need to do is add a line over the top of your rectangle, like that, from one corner to the other. That single line there is what the routing software will notice and will be able to set the engrave for. When you use a stopped housing, one thing you do need to know about is how to shape your shelf. So if I was creating a shelf to go in this area, I would be creating something to slightly different shape. So I'd probably create one side of it. Let's say my shelf is 350mm wide. I would create the sides of it so that they are not exactly the same length here. So that's 380. I'm going to make them 5mm less, so 375 on both sides. If I go to that point and then drag across, it will help me get that same position. Now I'm going to come in by the depth of my cut. So if it's 17mm material, I'm going to have an 8.5mm deep joint. I'm going to come in by 8.5 from that end, and this end, and then I'll come up using another line to the end point there. I'll do the same on the, zoom in a bit, and I'll join up just here. So I should end up with a profile there with a couple of little notches in the corners, and they should be 25mm from the edge, not 20, to make sure I don't have to try and chisel anything out later. So that's the general methods for creating parts on here. Like I said, sort of the most important things to make sure that we're able to cut it out is that it's 20mm from any edge and 30mm in between. When you're doing rebates or housings, you should leave them 5mm over the length. And where you have a stopped housing, the part that's joining it should be slightly different in length in this little cutaway here. All right, should be 25, 5mm more than whatever the stop area is. All right, so hopefully that'll give you enough information to go and model your pieces. One final tip, the grain direction of the plywood sheet is going left to right, this way. So if you want it running up the side of something, you would want to lay them on their side rather than upright in here. Otherwise it might look a little bit funny after it's all cut out. Okay, so there's some tips for you. Hopefully that'll help you go and draw the sketch for all your pieces. Thanks for watching.